You know, they say a man's home is his castle, but out here in the high desert of Wyoming, my ranch is more like my soul. It's 300 acres of dust, sagebrush, and history that my grandfather carved out of the wilderness back, when the only neighbors we had were the coyotes and the wind. And for 40 years, I've woken up to the smell of damp earth and the low rumble of cattle, thinking this piece was untouchable, until a woman named Beatrice moved into the luxury development 3 miles down the road and decided she didn't just want to live in the West, she wanted to rule it. I remember the exact moment the storm broke. I was sitting on my porch, boots up on the railing, watching the sun bleed orange across the Tetons while I sipped a coffee that was probably a little too strong. And then I saw it, a white SUV kicking up a cloud of dust on my private access road, driving way too fast for a path meant for tractors, and out stepped Beatrice, looking like she just walked off a golf course in Palm Springs, clutching a leather binder to her chest like it was a holy relic. And before I could even get howdy out, she was standing at the bottom of my steps, pointing a manicured finger at my Hereford bulls and telling me I had 48 hours to clear the nuisance or face immediate eviction. I just sat there for a second, honestly wondering if I'd had a stroke, because you don't just walk onto the Ironwood Ranch and talk about eviction. This land has been in the Miller name since the Eisenhower administration, and we don't even belong to an HOA, or so I thought. But Beatrice had this sharp, practiced smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes, and she informed me that because the new Clear Creek Estates had purchased the drainage rights and the surrounding buffer zones, my ranch had been absorbed into their jurisdiction through a series of legal maneuvers I wouldn't understand, and suddenly my life's work was zoning violation and my cattle were environmental hazards And as she stood there, smelling of expensive perfume and entitlement, I realized she wasn't just a neighbor. She was a predator who had spent months studying maps and tax codes just to find a way to take what was mine, simply because my fences didn't and oppose match her vision of curated wilderness, . She marched around my yard like she was inspecting a barracks, snapping photos of my rusted 1978 Ford and the stacks of seasoned firewood I'd spent all autumn chopping, muttering about aesthetic compliance and community standards while her two associates a pair of terrified-looking men in khakis who clearly didn't and oppose want to be there, shuffle behind her, and when I finally stood up, all 6'3" of me, and told her to get off my dirt before I called the sheriff, she didn't and oppose flinch. She just leaned in, her eyes cold as flint, and whispered that the sheriff was on the HOA and oppose advisory board, and that by Monday I'd be served with a court order that would make my head spin, because in her mind I was just relic of a dirty past that was lowering the property values of her $1-million McMansions. What Beatrice didn't and oppose, Tino, and this is the part where the story gets interesting, is that I haven and oppose. Just been a rancher for 40 years. See, back in the late 90s, after a particularly bad drought nearly wiped us out, I took a desk job to keep the lights on, and that desk job happened to be with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, specifically in the Division of Federal Regulatory Oversight for Common Interest Communities, which is a fancy way of saying I spent 25 years as the guy who audits HOA for the federal government. I know every statute, every obscure case law, and every dirty trick a board president can pull. And more importantly, I know exactly where the federal law ends and where a private citizen's rights begin, but I didn't and oppose. Tell her that I just watched her SUV disappear back down the road, feeling that slow burn anger settle into my bones. And I went inside, opened my old laptop, and started digging into the Clear Creek Estates filings, and boy, did I find a gold mine. By Saturday morning, the intimidation tactics had shifted into high gear. I woke up to find a cease and desist order taped to my gate, and a local deputy, a kid I'd known since he was in diapers named Cody, was sitting at the end of my driveway in his cruiser, looking absolutely miserable. And when I walked down to talk to him, he wooed and oppose. To even look me in the eye, he just said, Mr. Miller, Beatrice is calling in every favor in the county. She's claiming your runoff is poisoning the community well and that your livestock are a public health risk. They're trying to fast-track a condemnation order, end quote. And I realized then that this wasn't in Oppos. T just about an HOA board. It was a land grab. She wanted my 300 acres for a Phase 2 expansion. And she was using the HOA as a Trojan horse to bankrupt me with legal fees until I had no choice but to sell for pennies on the dollar. I spent that night surrounded by stacks of paper, my eyes blurring as I cross-referenced the Clear Creek bylaws with the Wyoming state statutes and federal fair housing codes. And that's when I saw the crack in her armor. It was small, but it was fatal. The HOA had been collecting, end quote, beautification fees, end quote, from the residents for 3 years to fund a private security force. But under the federal grant they'd accepted for their, end quote, green space, end quote, initiative, they were strictly prohibited from using community funds for private policing, and even better, Beatrice had signed off on a series of, end quote, administrative expenses, end quote, that looked an awful lot like payments to a landscaping company owned by her own brother-in-law. She wasn't an Oppos. T just a tyrant. She was a thief. And she had no idea that the man she was trying to evict was the one person in the United States who could pull the plug on her entire operation with a single phone call to the regional inspector general. The, end quote, hearing, end quote, was set for Tuesday at the community clubhouse. A glass and steel monstrosity that looked like a spaceship had crashed in the middle of the prairie. And when I walked in, wearing my best work shirt and a pair of clean jeans, the room went silent. Beatrice was sitting at the head of a long mahogany table, flanked by 4 other board members who looked like they were auditioning for a remake of the Stepford Wives. And she didn't end Oppos to even give me a chance to speak. She just started reading a list of, end quote, grievances, end quote, that sounded like something out of a dystopian novel. My cattle were too loud. My barn was the wrong shade of brown. My existence was a, end quote, burden on the collective peace, end quote. And she concluded by saying the board had voted unanimously to initiate a lien against my property for $500,000 in, end quote, accrued fines, end quote, which would effectively hand over my deed to the association by the end of the month. I let her finish. I let her sit there with that smug, victorious grin, and then I stood up, reached into my folder, and pulled out a single sheet of paper with the federal seal embossed at the top. And I said, end quote, Beatrice, I'm not here to argue about the color of my barn. I'm here as a senior compliance officer for the HUD Oversight Division to inform you that as of 8 a.m. this morning, Clear Creek Estates is under federal audit for the misappropriation of over $2 million in community funds and the violation of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, end quote. And you could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. The color drained out of her face so fast, I thought she was in a faint. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and the board members started looking at each other with this sudden, frantic terror, realizing they had signed their names to every single one of those fraudulent documents. I leaned over the table, my voice quiet but carrying through that whole room. And I told them that because they had attempted to use federal grant-funded infrastructure to intimidate a private landowner into a forced sale, I had already frozen the HOA's bank accounts and filed a request for a judicial receiver to take over the board, effectively firing all of them on the spot. And then I looked directly at Beatrice and said, end quote, and by the way, the sheriff ISN and Oppos, T coming to evict me, he's currently at your brother-in-law and Oppos' office with a search warrant, end quote. And for the first time in this whole mess, she didn't end Oppos. T have a snappy comeback. She just slumped back in her chair, looking small and fragile and incredibly guilty, while the neighbors who had been hiding in the back of the room started to cheer, because it turns out everyone in that development had been living under her thumb, paying fines for the crime of having the wrong kind of grass or a kid in Oppos as bicycle in the driveway. The fallout was spectacular. The HOA was dissolved and restructured under court supervision. Beatrice ended up facing 3 counts of wire fraud and had to sell her own house just to pay her legal fees. And the, end quote, Clear Creek Estates, end quote, became a much quieter, humbler place once the gates were taken down and the private security was sent packing. But the best part was, and Oppos, the victory in court. It was the following Sunday when I was back on my porch, watching the cattle graze on the land that was finally truly safe, and I saw a group of people from the development walking down my access road. and I reached for my shotgun instinctively. But then I saw they were carrying Tupperware and cooling pies. They just wanted to sit on the fence and watch the sunset, realizing that the, end quote, relic of the past, end quote, they'd been told to hate was actually the only thing keeping their community from turning into a corporate prison. It makes you wonder, though, how many other people are out there right now, staring a letter from an HOA board and feeling their stomach drop, thinking they're powerless against a group of bored neighbors with a little bit of authority and a lot of ego. Because the truth is, these organizations only have as much power as you give them. And sometimes, all it takes is one person who knows their rights to stand up and say, end quote, no, end quote, before the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. So, I'm curious, have any of you ever dealt with a, end quote, Beatrice, end quote, in your life? Someone who thought they could dictate how you live on your own land just because they had a clipboard and a title? Or do you think HOAs are necessary evil to keep neighborhoods from falling apart? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Because from where I'm sitting, the only thing that belongs on a ranch is cattle, not a board of directors.